everybody, and welcome to another podcast that we're going to do today. And today it's my honor to have Isaah Mhlanga with me. Hello, Isaah. And you
Hennie?
are the Chief Economist at RMB.
That's correct.
Tell us a little bit more about who you are and what brings you to this chair today.
Thank you for the invitation. Glad to be with you today. Obviously, I lead the research team at RMB. I'm also the chief economist. But I have been around for about 15 years in the industry. I have been a chief economist of Alex Forbes before RMB for about 5 years, where I cut my teeth on how to manage money. Before that, I was in public policy. I had a stint at the National Treasury, economic policy, and I started my career at the International Monetary Fund local office in Pretoria, where I learned to look at the global economy much more holistically. That was really my first job. So I think I've had a good start for an economist. Starting at the IMF is the best start one can ever have.
Certainly sounds like it. Isaah, thank you, and again, thank you for joining. So today we're going to talk a little bit about Africa's role in the global market. And it's quite interesting. I recently read reports, and maybe that's our starting point, that Africa may actually outstrip Asia this year from a growth point of view. So what is the economic standpoint of the region, and what is the role of SSA in the global economy in your mind?
If we look at the developments that are taking place geopolitically now, it's the fight for critical minerals. Most of these critical minerals we get across different countries. Case in point, think about cobalt. Almost every electronic device will have some cobalt in it. Think about copper. Almost every electronic device will have copper in it. If you think about renewable energy, you would require copper. If you think about the need for infrastructure development across the continent, but even in other continents as well, you would need copper. You also need minerals like manganese that we have here. Platinum group metals are still quite in demand. We have more than 70% of them in South Africa. If you combine with Zimbabwe, we have 90% of global non-reserves. That positions Africa as a potential supplier of all these critical minerals to the rest of the world. But what we haven't done as we should is the beneficiation of those minerals. That then says there's a massive opportunity for Africa, not just in the mining, but in the beneficiation, the value add, which then translate into finished products. That's where we might need to think hard as, African policymakers, African businesses. So that's the one part. The other part is, if you just look at demographics, the median age of Africa is about 19 years old. The second highest after that is Europe, just over 40 years old. All other continents, they have aging populations. Now, if you take the youthful population, you combine with proper skills, essentially education standards improving, that is a force that can transform a continent into a growth hub over the many, many years to come. We haven't actually harvested that dividend out of the youth. But we start to see it in the likes of Kenya, in the likes of Nigeria. The youth is quite vibrant. We're seeing it in different countries. We just need that to be at a continent-wide. Then we're going to see the benefit of that. So that's the dividend from the youthful population. There's also another dynamic. Think about estimates of where global population is going to be by 2050, which is not that far from where we are. It's just one generation away. 8 billion people, they would need to be fed. We have arable land, which is to a large extent not utilized to its full potential, which means Africa can actually be the food producer for the rest of the world. It then offers an opportunity for sectors such as agriculture, which are by and large, if you look at most African countries, they employ a lot of youth that has less skills, but you can also combine that with technology again, smart farming or agri-tech that can increase yields and productivity across the continent. It can then deal with some of the social issues that we have through things like unemployment, which can then absorb a lot of this youth into employment. So that's another, again, opportunity the continent can actually harvest. But we can also think about many other sectors, light manufacturing, combined with the minerals that we have, and the nearshoring and friendshoring of production processes that we see across the world. It would make sense for firms that need these minerals to be located closer to the source of these minerals and actually beneficiate and produce products for the rest of the world. That's an opportunity. But for that, we still have some gaps that we need to fill in terms of the predictability of policy, general infrastructure, electricity availability that is required to make sure that we can actually take those opportunities. So the opportunities are many.
Isaiah, thank you. And you've touched on a number of points, and I'm going to try and get back to all of them, but I want to just roll back to the beginning a little bit. And in the 2025 RMB Where to Invest report, and I'm going to quote you, you said, changes in the political and subsequent policy environment and declining foreign aid, coupled with the redirection of global capital flows, are reshaping how African economies engage with the world, moving from dependence towards resilience and self-determination. The way I look at it is to say we've got to move from aid to trade in Africa. So with that, summarizing maybe your point, how do we do this? Can you elaborate on that for me? Because I think the thing that is frustrating me and potentially many of our listeners is we've been having this narrative around our mineral wealth and our arable land and all of that for some time now. How do we make this work? How do we go to that next phase where we start executing on this?
One would say the current geopolitical shifts are a blessing in disguise. As long as aid was available, policymakers and governments had no need to actually say we need to build our own capacity because aid was there.
Yeah, in fact, nowhere in history have you seen any country creating wealth through aid. Right?
Absolutely, there's no test case for an individual country which has improved from low income to high income to advance on the basis of aid. So it almost boggles the mind why African leaders and business people would think aid is the way to grow economies. Yes, it's necessary in times of disasters. Everybody needs some help, but we can't depend for critical sectors of the economy on aid. Those critical sectors will include health. We can't fund health on the basis of aid. It's national security. We can't fund national security on the basis of aid. Things like water, we can't fund water on the basis of aid. You can even think about skills development, because if a country doesn't have skills, then its economy gets crippled. So those sectors for me would have to be funded out of the fiscus of countries, to be self-dependent, and you can chart a path on how you want those skills how you want those sectors to evolve. Now, with these geopolitical shifts and the withdrawal of aid from Europe, from the US, in part because they also need the funding to fund the war in Ukraine, and perhaps the reconstruction of Ukraine once the war is done. But for the US, they are looking inward. It says to many policymakers, you need to rethink how you manage your own economies to be self-reliant, particularly for the critical parts of those economies. So that's an opportunity which comes at an inconvenient time, because they didn't prepare for this aid withdrawal. And some countries are more exposed than others. The likes of Mozambique, for instance, are a lot more exposed from an aid perspective than others. Now, what do we say in the publication that you referenced? Simply say we need to look at trade as one of the levers that we need to do. Openness to trade is quite critical, which then says the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement, it's very important. But in itself, without supporting environment, it's not going to fly. Yes, as a framework, it's good, but we need to enable that framework to work. So let's look at export potential. What are the products that we have that we can export to countries that are importing those products but not from Africa. As an example, to actually say these are the countries that we can increase our exports. You can then fund our own development through export revenues. That's a much more sustainable way to develop economies. It's on a business to business, not on a aid, from aid perspective.
But Isaiah, and I'm interrupting you, my apologies for that. But just on that, what are the quick wins under the Africa Free Trade Agreement? In your mind, if you had to say to me, Hennie, I think the following, some of the low-hanging fruit, what would that be?
For countries to trade, people have to move freely, easily. So the quick wins, I would say, the easiness of people to move from country to country, because ultimately it is people that strike business deals. It is people that get into trade agreements. If you can move from here to Cote d'Ivoire directly, you are unlikely going to go there and strike a trade deal if it's difficult for you to do so. You would rather go to a neighboring country if it's easier to move. You go to Botswana or you go to Namibia because it's easy, just one flight, you are there in 2 hours, and then you negotiate business deals. But if you have to apply for a visa, it takes 6 months for you to get that visa before you can go into that country.
How is it possible that we still have to apply for visas intra-Africa when all we talk about on these public stages is about the Africa Free Trade Agreement? What are policymakers missing? Because for a layman like me, it would appear it's one of the easiest decisions to just say, take away the visa requirement. Well, yet we take it away for people outside of this continent to come in visa-free. What are we missing, Isaiah?
Look, there's so many elements. Some would say they are justified. Some are framed in a national security perspective. Think, for instance, South Africa. We're the most industrialized economy in Africa. We have an inflow of immigrants, sometimes to a large extent illegally, which then puts a lot of pressure on infrastructure. That's one of the reasons that is cited to say we haven't planned for such a large volume of people our infrastructure cannot handle. That's one of the reasons that's used. But there is also a benefit out of that. You have cheap supply of labor, which can be used across different sectors of the economy. If you think about China's growth has grown to a large extent because labor has been cheap, so industries relocated from the US and other regions to go into China. Now China has developed. So there are pros and cons to some of the factors which are cited as a reason why not to allow free movement of people.
But surely, Isaiah, surely if we say, let's take your example, South Africa. We say they, at the moment, according to the law, the way it stands, they are here illegal. 7, 8 out of 10 times, as to your point, they're here because they hustle. They're hustling. They're making a living. But because they're here illegally, the country doesn't see the benefit economically of that hustling. Wouldn't it be a lot easier and a lot more beneficial to take away some of those constraints and actually legalize it so that we can get part of that benefit into the fiscus? It can be used for the development of infrastructures as one example.
Absolutely, but you always get pushback from other sectors of society that says we have high unemployment rate. Those jobs should be for South Africans, which is a genuine reason to push back. But if you look at many metropolitan cities globally, they've been built because you had an inflow of skilled people that come with different ideas than what you would have in the local city. That makes it a thriving city. That you can think about London, you can think about New York, you can think about many other cities globally. Even if you take Johannesburg, for instance, it's a bustling pot of different people from different spaces, which makes it a lot more dynamic. So there are benefits long term, but the pressure for politicians is that the cycle is linked to the the governance or you could say an administration cycle, they tend not to think ultra long term, which is why we tend to see short-term decisions being made that over the long term are not so much beneficial. That's why you see sometimes pressure to resist, to say let's open up free movement of people, which can then enable trade to follow. If you think about Europe, it works because of the free movement of people first. Even you think about the United States, it's a confederation of 50 states. They can move freely. Where trade thrives, you'll see the underpinning is that people can move freely. So that would be, for me, the first quick win. Enable people to move freely, and then alongside that, have the right infrastructure. Can we have a direct flight to any other African country? At least fly within the continent. You keep that spend in the continent. So far, you would find that it's easier to fly out of the continent and back into the continent, which means that
and
money...
sometimes cheaper.
Absolutely, and sometimes cheaper and quicker, which means we have to develop this infrastructure for us to do so, to move within the continent. For bulk goods, think about the copper mined in Zambia. Think about the cobalt from the DRC. Think about oil in Nigeria. How does that travel from place to place into inland? It's so difficult. It takes so many days. The trucks we see on the N1 from Zambia, through Zimbabwe sometimes, through Botswana sometimes, the road infrastructure wasn't built for such volumes of trucks. Accidents become a lot more, delays in trading, which makes the cost of actually moving those products from country to country a lot more. Can we just have railway lines that can simplify, much more secure, cheaper, and efficient? That infrastructure is quite important to underpin the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement. If that is not there, this remains a very long-term dream that we can't actually realize the benefits.
But on that, I mean, whenever we talk about the lack of infrastructure and the many billions it'll require in order to establish that. What are you seeing from an FDI point of view? And I guess my question is based purely economically, firstly, but secondly, with this shift in geopolitics in Africa, and this is a bit of a generic statement, but my view and my experience is that we're seeing Africa changing its gaze, and it's looking a lot more towards the east, a lot more to UAE. We see a lot more activity coming in from Turkey. We see a lot more activity coming in from India. What is your sense on FDI? Is it going to improve? Is it going to improve in the right way? What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I think with the withdrawal of aid, to our earlier point, you have seen a replacement of that aid with FDI. In 2024, for instance, we saw $97 billion worth of FDI into Africa. The majority of that came via Egypt. You also see a lot of FDI into Morocco, into Tunisia. So we are seeing FDI into infrastructure, but that infrastructure is linked to commodities. Think about the Lobito corridor from Zambia, DRC into Angola. It's linked to copper and other critical minerals. There is also developments of rail infrastructure in the West, which is linked to the automotive sector to a large extent. So we are seeing FDI come into the continent, not to the extent that is required. There are estimates that say you would need about $1.4 trillion worth of investments into infrastructure. That is going to actually power the growth in the African continent. We are still way short of what is required.
So, Isaah, I want to interrupt you there, and maybe a little bit controversially so. But in the beginning of the conversation, you spoke about beneficiation. Now we're talking about FDI, and we're talking about that FDI going into infrastructure, and the one that's on everybody's lips is this railway line. How does that stack up to the beginning of the conversation where we talk about beneficiation. Isn't this railway line and this infrastructure still in exacerbating that same problem where that raw product is getting exported? How do we balance that?
So, foreign governments want access to minerals, but we have the ability to say to them, can we rather establish manufacturing and processing plant here where we can add value before the minerals are exported? So it depends on how we negotiate. We are not helpless in the process.
But are we negotiating the right things?
So far, the evidence says we are not yet. But we are seeing some countries, take significant decisions and investments into processing. Take Nigeria. Botswana, take Nigeria as an example. Build an oil refinery over a couple of years.
Fantastic.
It's now finished.
Yeah.
They used to export oil to import petrol. Now that has stopped. They are a net seller of petrol into other neighboring countries, which means the forex they needed to import, they no longer need now. So that actually stabilizes the macroeconomy. They cut fuel subsidies because they can now supply into the domestic economy. So that's an example of a fantastic story that we have seen out of Nigeria.
Is it a story that we tell enough?
We don't tell it enough. And of course, this is not just about Nigeria. Many of the positive stories across the continent, we don't tell them properly. Our stories are told outside of the continent, which is why, in part, we write the Way to Invest in Africa publication, to tell the story that is data-driven out of in-country people that have the nuances of what's happening locally, so that when an investor offshore picks it up, they can have a much more disaggregated and nuanced view of what's happening in countries. Because most of the time, we tell problems of the continent. We don't tell the opportunities that are in the continent and the developments from a policy environment. And what we have seen in the last 2 years, many countries have tweaked policies. Some have done an overhaul of policies that have made it a lot more conducive for investors, which is why we are seeing the continent start to turn positively. The story of Nigeria that we spoke about, you can think about Zambia that was in a debt restructuring. The story has turned positive. Ghana as well has also turned positive. If you think about East Africa, Kenya, we're seeing the same. Ethiopia is also in the process where we are seeing policy developments that is quite encouraging for investment. Also South Africa. The story of Operation Vulindlela and reforms in energy and logistics and the water sector that's
just
coming.
Full transparency, I'm a part of that.
Absolutely.
So just full transparency on that.
So we're seeing a lot of those developments that are coming through, that are saying Africa is turning a corner across many countries, and we can see markets responding positively to that.
Isaah, how do we take this story? Global investors, generally speaking, look for stability and predictability based on normal financial models and modeling for ROI. We don't have that. We're a fragmented continent. We don't have a common currency. We still have many ills from the past. How do we pique investors' interests in a way that the available capital favors this continent?
In my mind, into something that we try to put in the Way to Invest in Africa, where we have a 6-factor model that we use that is data-driven. It tries to say what really drives growth are these variables over a long term. And we measure all of them, we standardize all of them, such that if an investor takes the same data and use the same methodology, they'll come to the same conclusion. So there's transparency. That's one. Secondly, from a policy perspective, there is need to demonstrate that policy lives beyond the political cycle. If there is a change in government because the elections democratic, the policies that have been established in the previous administration, as long as they are good for the economy, they are good for uplifting people, those policies remain. I think that's where the messaging from policymakers need to be a lot more strong. And in my experience, don't see that a lot. If I were to demonstrate with a couple of changes that we saw over the last 2 years, in Botswana there have been a change in government to opposition since independence. You have seen also in Ghana opposition, coming into government. In South Africa, we now have government of national unity. In all those countries, there is need to say, beyond this political cycle, the reforms we have done in this sector and that sector, they are going to outlive the political cycle. That gives confidence to the investor to say, if you invest in this current environment, you are not going to encounter new rules once the political cycle have changed. You are going to get the same rules that you invested on the basis of. So you can actually invest beyond the political cycle. And that is the typical investment cycle of corporates. They don't invest for 2 years. They invest for 10, 20 years. Because to build a proper manufacturing plant, potentially it can take you 2-3 years. By the time you finish, there's a new government or a new dispensation. So they need to know that the policies are going to outlive. That communication is quite poor.
Isaah, we've got to start wrapping up, and I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. In your professional opinion, will Africa in 2026 grow faster than Asia? And that's not the last question, by the way.
Yeah. Look, we're thinking Africa is potentially 4 to 5% over the next 2 years or so. But it was safe to say there is divergence in that growth. East Africa is growing quite strong. Some countries in West Africa also quite strong. So in East Africa, if you take Ethiopia, 7% plus. If you take Kenya, 6% plus. In West Africa, Cote d'Ivoire, also about 6% plus. You have some drags that are coming out of Nigeria in the West African region. In Southern Africa, we also have a drag out of South Africa because we're growing at 1 to 1.5%, so that drags quite poor. But even then, we're also seeing a pickup from where we have been. The reforms are starting to show up in credit rating upgrades, showing up in removal from grey listing. All of those are actually saying there's an improvement, and you can see it in the currency as well. So it's not homogeneous across the region. There's divergence. But the direction is quite positive across many countries. They have done a lot of reforms. If we were to go beyond this year, which is essentially what we need to do, look long term, we should actually see better growth because we are seeing reforms that are taking place. So I'm quite positive about the continent. I think we are going to see better growth in future.
My final question, thank you, Isaah, to you is this. What can we, as private sector, do better to tell the Africa growth story to the rest of the world?
So perhaps before we tell it, we must recognize that we are partners with governments, not in competition. We must co-create a lot of the solutions that are required. We must tell governments we need an operating environment that is enabling for business, because ultimately the majority of growth comes from the private sector, not from government. The majority of jobs are created by the private sector, not by government. So we must not sit back and expect government to come up with the solutions. A lot of the solutions and innovation, they sit in the private sector. So in some instance, we need to actually say to government, this is the direction of travel. And this is the enabling environment that we require. And we do our fair share of paying taxes as corporates do, but we must demand out of government the right operating environment, stable rules, and predictable policy over the long term. We must demand those things because sometimes government, given their limited political cycles, they might not think long term enough. And then we should be able to be advocates of those policies once they have been given. In whatever environment where we go. Think about Davos, we should have private sector presence that's saying we have seen this policy environment and we are comfortable as local businesses that can attract foreign businesses as well.
Isaah Mhlanga, Chief Economist at RMB, it's fantastic. Thank you for joining me, and I hope we can continue this conversation far beyond just this podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed it and look forward to some of your comments on it. Thank you very much.